Emotions ran high as the Supreme Court heard cases regarding the constitutionality of the Defense of Marriage Act and California's Proposition 8. And now we wait. It will be months before a decision is reached, but there's plenty of time for both sides to argue their case in the court of public opinion. And we turn now to Aisha and Danielle Moody Mills, LGBT rights activists at the Center for American Progress. They're also married, we should note. Thomas Peters with the National Organization for Marriage, which opposes same-sex marriage. And Steve Ramil, constitutional law professor at American University. Good to see all of you. Steve, let me start with you.
Great to be with you.
Steve, I know you've studied the Supreme Court extensively. You know the ins and outs of these cases. Let's play the game that you've been playing a lot of this week, I'm sure. If you were a gambling man, what would you bet the court will decide?
Well, thanks for having me, Craig. It's always a danger to gamble on the Supreme Court, as we discovered last June when they upheld President Obama's health care law, even though everybody was betting that it would be struck down. So betting is a cautious thing here. But the justices seemed really not anxious to get to the heart of whether there's a constitutional right to same-sex marriage in the California case. But there seemed like a fair amount of concern about the discrimination brought about by the federal law, the Defense of Marriage Act. So I would say the court will strike down the Defense of Marriage Act. There are really too many options for how they might resolve the California case, I think, to really bet.
Aisha and Danielle, you two have been very vocal gay rights activists in Washington. You've launched an LGBT policy initiative at the Center for American Progress. And again, you've been married since 2010. How significant has it been for you to have same-sex marriage go before the Supreme Court this week?
It's been completely significant. This has been an extraordinary week for equality. But in terms of whether or not we should be gambling on what the Supreme Court is going to decide, it really is about right or wrong. Should all of Americans be covered under the law, or should we not? And that's pretty much where we are right now.
Aisha?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. You know, we're optimistic about the way the courts are going to come down, but our entire argument, if you will, has simply been that we should be treated the same as everybody else with regards to our laws here in this country. It's not about whether you think that I should be married to whom I'm married to. It's really about whether the law should treat us the same as all of our other neighbors who are married as well.
Thomas, a steady stream of politicians, as I'm sure you're aware, have been coming out in favor of same-sex marriage. Most recently, Democratic Senators Claire McCaskill and Kay Hagan. This is what Chief Justice John Roberts had to say about that on Wednesday, and I found it especially interesting. Take a listen.
You don't doubt that the lobby supporting the enactment of same-sex marriage laws in different states is politically powerful, do you? As far as I can tell, political figures are falling over themselves to endorse your side of the case.
Thomas, what do you make of that? I mean, why do you think we've seen such a flurry of high-profile politicians coming out in favor of it?
Well, I think what John Roberts was asking was a really fascinating question, because currently gay marriage activists are claiming that they're politically powerless, and that's why we have to strike down laws defending marriage like the Defense of Marriage Act and Proposition 8. Whereas what the Chief Justice is saying is that actually gays and lesbians are very politically powerful. The president supports them, the Democratic Party platform supports them, and so the idea that we need to strike down laws protecting marriage is absurd. What we need to uphold is that people have the ultimate right to decide marriage laws. The states, the democratic process is working, and we hope the Supreme Court will acknowledge the votes of over 45 million Americans who have voted to protect marriage as a union of one man and one woman.
Actually,
go ahead. I wanted to let Thomas finish, but go ahead.
Let me jump in here because I want to clarify that we're not talking about political power. We're not having a conversation here that says that because there's one group of citizens who may or may not have political power, then rights don't apply to them. What we're saying is that without regard to this quote-unquote mythical political power, which we could have a conversation about in another conversation, is that every citizen of this country should be treated the same under the law. It's very, very simple. It has nothing to do with who has more money, with who has more perceived power, because that's what he's alluding to. It doesn't matter who you are. You should be treated the same, and that is the simple question. Discrimination cannot stand in America.
Steve,
well,
Steve,
hang on, guys.
Hang on 1 second. Steve, I want to bring you back in here because let's talk about the Equal Protection Clause for just a second here. And can you give us some sense of what the High Court has said about that particular clause in the past?
Well, the political powerlessness issue is one that the court has used for deciding the degree to which different groups need the protection of the Equal Protection Clause. Even at a time, for example, when women made up more than half of the population, the Supreme Court said that they were lacking in adequate political power and found that the Equal Protection Clause should deal with gender discrimination. So that's an important factor. The court hasn't really elevated discrimination based on sexual orientation to some higher level that gets extra protection under the Equal Protection Clause. And that's one of the critical questions here is, will the court do that?
Thomas, I think you're about to jump in there and say something. What were you about to say?
No, actually, I was going to do something that never happens on cable news. I was going to ask Steve to make that exact point, that what I was talking about was a very precise legal argument that actually both sides are debating right now. But back to the core issue, gay and lesbian people are free to live and love as they choose. What they don't have the right to do is redefine marriage for everyone else. Again, the democratic process is working here. 7 million Californians were barraged with TV ads. They had heartfelt conversations, and they chose to protect marriage. And when they did, our opponents went to the courts to try to get that overturned. Now, we believe that laws protecting marriage have a rational basis, namely that government has an interest in incentivizing that most children, in most cases, will be raised by the mother and father where they do best.
Thomas, I want to ask you about that last point that you just made, because one of the justices addressed that point during the hearings, and I found it particularly interesting what she said. She said basically, using that argument, then why would we allow folks who are 50 years old and older to ever get married if there's no chance that they may procreate?
Right. That's very simple, because they don't undermine the public purpose of marriage. Most men are actually fertile through most of their life cycle. If a man is with a woman, and even if that woman is not infertile, he's not creating fatherless children outside of that marriage. Marriage takes the union of one man and one woman, which creates a child, and guarantees, in whatever possible, that man and woman who made that child are also there to raise it. Now, instead of redefining marriage to make that more difficult than it already is, as we know, we should be supporting and building up marriage, not undefining it.
Aisha, go ahead, Aisha.
I can think of no better way to build up marriage than to make sure that everyone that wants to get married, and that out of the 7 billion people that exist on the planet, that when you find that other person to love and be loved by, that you can build a family together. There is no better way to uphold and build marriage up than to allow everyone the same rights and responsibilities as their neighbors and friends.
Right.
Steve, what were the main distinctions that you saw in the rhetoric between how the justices discussed Prop 8 versus how they talked about DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act?
Well, I think that the Defense of Marriage Act is a more manageable issue for them. The discrimination there is clearer to the justices. States have recognized same-sex marriages in 9 states, and the federal government is not willing to acknowledge the validity of those marriages. I think that's more tangible to them than the question of whether the Constitution absolutely protects same-sex marriage in all circumstances. So the questions really went to that distinction, I think.
Aisha and Danielle, race came into play during some of the back and forth between Justice Scalia and Proposition 8 challenger Ted Olson Tuesday. Take a listen to that exchange.
I'm curious, when did it become unconstitutional to exclude homosexual couples from marriage? 1791, 1868, when the 14th Amendment was adopted?
May I answer this in the form of a rhetorical question? When did it become unconstitutional to prohibit interracial marriages?
How closely connected are the issues of same-sex marriage and interracial marriage?
Well, I would say that they're from a case law standpoint, they're connected simply because we're seeing a very similar pattern here where people are being told that they are not able to get married based on nothing, pretty much based on nothing other than discrimination and someone's opinions about that group. So at the time with interracial marriage, it was because white people didn't like black people. They didn't believe that black people were worthy. They thought that black people were inferior. And so they said, okay, well, we don't want you to get married just because we don't like you. The same thing is happening right now. There's no logical or rational reason why same-sex marriage is problematic for any of the people who are opposing it. It's simply this case of, well, we don't like you, so we don't think that you should have rights. Now, it's fine if you don't like us, you don't care for us. We certainly don't have to worship with you. We won't ask your clergy to marry us. But to say that the law has to treat us differently and discriminate against us simply because you don't like us is just simply not what we do here in America, and it's not going to last much longer.
No. I just have to really disagree with that. Here's the laws against interracial marriage were meant to keep the races separate so they wouldn't have children together, and they were wrong. Marriage is meant to bring men and women together so they have children, which is right. And so you cannot compare these two things at all. And furthermore, I think it's really important what she brought up. The 45 million Americans who have voted to protect marriage are not motivated by animus towards gay people. They're motivated out of love for the institution. And if the Supreme Court Justice, if the Supreme Court were to rule, I'm sorry, just finish my thought. If the Supreme Court were to rule that laws defining marriage are akin to bigotry, then every person in this country who believes that children have a right to a mother and a father will be treated as bigots under the law. That's exactly why I think Steve and others might agree with me that the Supreme Court's not going to go there. Like, we can work this out through the political process. The debate can continue. Questions as central as marriage should not be decided by the Supreme Court. They should be decided by the people.
Let's talk about the children, though. I do want to talk about the children.
10 seconds. I would love to talk about the children.
There are over 2 million children right now who are being raised by gay and lesbian couples. Okay, and those children are being discriminated against and being done harm because our government refuses to acknowledge their families.
Steve, I want to bring you back.
No, that's not true at all. No, that's not true at all.
Steve, I want to bring you back in here to wrap this thing up because that was a point that Justice Kennedy made during the hearings this week. He did mention the 20,000 the 20,000 or so children in California who could potentially be affected, I suppose, or children in the future who might be affected. How much do we think that will factor into a decision by the High Court?
I mean, I think that's an important issue. It suggests that this issue is much more complicated to the justices than just traditional notions of marriage or marriage serving the purpose of procreation. There's a lot more going on in these relationships, and those kind of limited visions of what marriage means may not really work for the justices. Can I make one other quick point
really quickly?
About Justice Scalia? He acts as if the 14th Amendment is sort of self-explanatory, but it took us 100 years to discover that it prohibited interracial marriage. It's not self-explanatory. It needs the Supreme Court to step in and act.
Loving Virginia, 1967. I believe that's the case you're referring to there. Right. Aisha and Danielle Moody-Mills, Steve Ramil, and Thomas Peters. I do want you to know that I caught your snide comment there about cable news, but I would like to point out that we just devoted some 13 minutes to what I felt was a fairly balanced conversation. So take that.
And I applaud you for that.